Okay, we are recording now. Okay, and welcome to Great Decisions 2021, where our speaker today is Stephen Stine, and he'll be talking about global supply chains and national security. Before we begin, I just want to announce that this lecture series is a collaboration of the League of Women Voters of Tyler Smith County, the AAUW, the American Association of University Women of Tyler, the Tyler Public Library, and the Foreign Policy Association. So this should be a good talk. I thank Stephen for presenting it, and it is simultaneously both kind of, from the public policy point of view, it's our most esoteric of our 8 topics, yet it's also curiously the one which most directly relates to our own lives, which I'm sure he will elucidate quite well. But now we'll introduce him. Professor Stephen B. Stine has served as a full-time professor at Tyler Junior College since 1998, teaching history, government, and economics. From 1995 to 1998, he was an instructor at the University of Memphis. Professor Stine holds a bachelor's degree in economics with honors from Texas Tech University and graduate degrees in history and finance from the University of Memphis and Rutgers University. He has completed graduate programs in political science, economics, Spanish literature, and theology from Texas Tech University, New York University, the University of Texas at Tyler, the University of Texas at El Paso, and the University of the South at Sewanee. Professor Stine was ordained in 1986 as a permanent vocational deacon in the Episcopal Church and has served congregations in Texas, New Mexico, Tennessee, and Mexico. Since 1998, he has served as the deacon of the clergy staff of the Christ Episcopal Church here in Tyler. And so with that, I will welcome, and we are honored to have Stephen Stine speak. And so Professor Stine, the floor is now yours.
Dr. Crean, thank you for inviting me, and my thanks to Marilyn Willis and the League of Women Voters chapter in Tyler, and for arranging for this program, and also to Dr. Tammy Burnett, professor at TJC, who is the Zoom coordinator for today's program. Without the work of Dr. Crean, Dr. Burnett, and Marilyn Willis, we wouldn't be here. Marilyn Wills, excuse me, we wouldn't be here today, and I certainly wouldn't be able to present this program because I know nothing about computers, and I'm very challenged on the subject of modern technology. I'm speaking today on Thursday, February 18th in Tyler. We're still under a heavy blanket of snow. This reminds me of what my professor of Russian history at Texas Tech University, Dr. Idris Traylor, would say. This is a beautiful day, beautiful spring day in St. Petersburg. So if you can keep everything in perspective, we can maybe deal with this weather crunch. I want to make 3 points today about global supply chains and the issue of national security. The first is that we, as we have always had, needed, we need international trade. We need international trade, not just for economic reasons, but also for geopolitical reasons, to develop infrastructure, a big word that floats around in our conversation. And we also need it to reduce military tensions, and I'll address the limits of that in this talk. Secondly, I want to point out that not everyone benefits from increased international trade, that there are predatory forces within the international community. And when a nation becomes dependent on sources of supply that can be cut off at different times, or can be in effect held for ransom, this creates political problems. And we can see some of this in the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And the third point that I want to make is that despite all the difficulties, everything points in, despite all the difficulties of this current age, current period, all signs are pointing toward greater interdependence, especially as we become a more technologically sophisticated world, a more technologically advanced world, which leads us to greater connections with many countries, and opens up opportunities for trade and for cultural exchanges and for political and economic exchanges that have not existed to this point. So let me go back to my let me go to the first point, and that is the absolute need for international trade. Humanity is always engaged in trade. There's evidence, for instance, that in the 1200s and 1300s, the Aztec Empire in central Mexico was trading not only with the peoples of the Mississippi Valley region, the mound builders, the people of Cahokia and that area and the upper Mississippi River, but they were also trading, there is evidence that they were trading with people in West Africa. So trade is something that has been fundamental to world development. And for the most part, we are in a period of the greatest level of free trade that we've ever seen. And by free trade, we mean there's few restrictions and inhibitions of trade are in place. The United States at various times has been a very protectionist nation. We are probably overall at, especially with the change in administrations in Washington, we're probably entering a period of our lowest level of protectionism. There's still some of that, but for the most part, we have become advocates of free trade. And this was not always the case. In the early days of our republic, during the period of the Civil War, post-Civil War, up until through the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, the United States was, for the most part, a protectionist nation. We were behind Great Britain, the leading economic power at the time in terms of free trade. But since the Roosevelt administration, since the FDR administration starting in 1933, the United States has steadily removed restrictions in terms of tariffs, licensing requirements, the quotas, import quotas. We have gradually reduced that. We still have those, but we have much greater free trade. And this has contributed enormously to the American economy, to the growth of the U.S. economy, which is 5 times bigger now than it was in the 1960s, at a time when we had a very greatly expansive economy. So trade is fundamental to economic growth. However, we should also keep in mind something that President John F. Kennedy said on the subject of tax policy, and I think it also applies to the subject of trade, especially the creation of supply chains. And that is, he said in relation to tax policy, a rising tide lifts all boats unless they are sunk. His point was, and I think we can apply this to trade, is that wealthier countries tend to benefit generally more than poorer countries in terms of free trade. But that is not an exclusive, and we've seen evidence in the last 30 to 40 years of the change that has come about, that there have been benefits to free trade, to opening up supply chains that have benefited smaller countries. Give you an example. In the 1970s, the nation of Bangladesh, which was then East Pakistan, entered into revolt against the government of Pakistan, separated, became an independent nation, and mainly with the support of India, which wanted to do everything and continues to do a lot to try to keep Pakistan off balance. And it almost instantly became the poorest nation in the world, a densely packed, a densely populated country. But in the last 20 years or so, because of textile manufacturing, sometimes brought about at great human cost, Bangladesh has become the fastest growing economy, as the fastest growing economy in percentage of any country in the world. And this country, which was faced enormous dire poverty, is still a poor country, but the overall tide of growth has lifted many people out of certainly dire poverty, and has also stabilized the government of Bangladesh, which now no longer turns to the military to maintain stability, which unfortunately is the case in Pakistan. And this is an example that, and it's come about because of allowing a greater flow of trade with other parts of the world, particularly with textile manufacturing. But at the same time, textile manufacturing, which has increased in countries like Bangladesh, Jordan, Honduras, Vietnam, other countries, has also meant that countries that formerly had large industrial sectors devoted to textiles have lost out to countries that have lower labor costs, that have a lower supply cost, but have also, and in many cases, do not have the kinds of labor protection that we could expect in countries even like the United States or Mexico or other countries, even in the Americas. So we need foreign trade. We need this kind of healthy, vigorous trade. And in general, it helps the world economy. The world economy has grown because of this trade. Technology has allowed us to move much more easily. When I taught economics at TJC, I'd always tell my students that maybe not today because of our St. Petersburg spring weather, but on a normal day, I could drive to the airport in Tyler, get on a plane, go to DFW, change to another plane, and on Singapore Air, and in 12 hours, I could be in Singapore. Now that tells you how rapidly the world has changed, and that pace of change continues, not just physical movement, but also the movement of goods and services through the internet, through electronic, through computers. These are opening up all over the world, and this benefits countries in general. The world economy has grown as a result. Some nations, a number of nations have benefited, like my example of Bangladesh, but it's certainly often where there are improvements for one country economically is because industries have moved to another country. But I also want to make this point about our concern. Let's move to point number 2, and that is concerns about the national security and the issue of protection of supply chains. Let me start with an example. The Abrams tank, named after General Creighton Abrams, and I have a good friend who teaches political science who served under Creighton Abrams during the Vietnam War. My friend said he got the Bronze Star because he baked a beautiful birthday cake for General Abrams. I think that's a little facetious, but General Abrams was a prominent artillery, was a prominent tank commander. And so this the tank that's still the major tank that the United States uses is named after Abrams. There is no component of the Abrams tank that is manufactured in the United States. Every component is manufactured in some other country. The computer system comes from Belgium. The firing mechanisms are developed in Italy. The shells that it actually fires are also developed in Italy. The actual cannon on the Abrams tank is from Italy. The entire Abrams tank is assembled in Canada and then shipped into the United States, and there becomes the major tank of the United States Army. Well, the question you might ask, how American is this great American tank? But at the same time, we might ask the question, how safe is our tank? Well, I think as long as we're dealing with the Belgians and the Italians, we're probably pretty safe. They're members of NATO and longtime allies, at least since World War II. So we're probably fairly safe in that respect. But what happens when we become dependent on other countries? For instance, China. We have a very strong trade relationship with China. Interestingly, though, it's not our major trading partner. Our major trading partner is still Canada, and our second trading partner in terms of volume is Mexico, and China comes in third. But we have increasingly become dependent upon China initially for goods that were fairly like textiles, for clothing, those types of goods. The expression "made in China" originally was a disparaging term, but as China's economy has grown and become more technologically sophisticated, more technologically advanced, we have looked to China for computer devices, for software, areas are they're often called intellectual property. And we have also confronted the age-old problem of industrial espionage, something that goes back literally centuries, and something that's part of our economy today. So how safe are we in terms of bringing in software from China? The United States and China differ on a number of geopolitical issues. We are rivals in the Pacific and in other parts of Asia. China wants to build reestablish the old Silk Road system so that they can become more influential in the economies of Central Asia, even into Eastern Europe. At what point do we continue trading, but make it clear that we have to protect ourselves against malware in computers, for instance? And how much do we assert our belief that all nations should adhere, as we seek to do, to the Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations from 1948, which has been, even though China is a signatory to it through its membership in the UN, has consistently been violated by China. This brings me to a sub point I want to make about leverage. And when we have economic leverage over countries, then we're more likely to be able to suggest to them that they take different courses as far as their treatment of dissidents and their promotion or lack of promotion of democracy. Good example of this is the recent military coup, the most recent of a number of military coups in Myanmar, the old Burma. Well, the United States has responded by telling the military government that until they restore until they restore democratic government under Aung San Suu Kyi, the state counselor, that the United States is not going to provide military and economic support. We'll see how far that goes. But the problem for the United States and China is that we have very little leverage over China economically, in the sense that China buys a lot of our debt. One of the reasons we've been able to expand our economy is that when necessary, we have increased the debt. Our debt is still the go-to safe harbor for investors around the world. But since China buys so much of our debt, we have very little leverage with them in that sense to exert any kind of efforts to try to promote democracy and to promote freer trade with China. At the same time, China is very dependent upon the American populace. The Chinese economy, keep in mind that 7/12 of all the people in China are still engaged in agriculture or related to agriculture. In the United States, it's about 1.5%, maybe 2%. So China, this means that for the most part, agriculturally based economies do not generate the kinds of income which allow people to buy the kinds of sophisticated goods that the Chinese economy is generating. And who is going to buy those goods? Well, the United States, despite our downturn in the economy in the last couple of years, certainly in the year of the pandemic, is still the biggest economy in the world. And certainly proportionally and per capita basis, we're far above any other country and will be for probably another couple of decades. So this creates this atmosphere, this situation creates an interdependence, which can lead to greater cooperation. Keep in mind, though, free trade, expansion of trade is not necessarily the end all and the answer to every geopolitical problem. Throw in an example. In 1914, the Russian Empire and the German Empire were each other's biggest trading partners. And despite that fact, and despite the fact that you would think that they would be reluctant to go to war, they did go to war in 1914. Russia declared war on Germany, Germany declared war on Russia, and this, of course, contributed to the cataclysm of World War I. So trade in and of itself is not going to guarantee the kind of openings that sometimes we can expect. But at the same time, let's look to the United States and Mexico. The subject of trade between the United States and Mexico, our relations between the U.S. and Mexico have been very politically charged over the last 40 years, if not even longer. The United States and Mexico are our second biggest trading partner. Despite all the furor over building fences and restricting migration between the United States and Mexico, our trade with Mexico has increased. Just throw in this little factoid that you can share with your friends whenever we get back to having cocktail parties. The largest Walmart in the world is in Mexico City. It has 200 checkout lines, checkout stations. It's open 24 hours a day. And over 2/3 of the products that are purchased, that are sold at that Walmart, are American-made products. So trade with Mexico has been very beneficial to both countries, despite some of the heated, fervent, feverish political rhetoric of the last decades, particularly the last 5 years. But trade has been beneficial for both countries, and it has also contributed to our increased trade and our increased willingness to work with Mexico, which is coming to fruition with the recent opening by the Biden administration to reworking the agreements between Mexico, with the United States, Mexico, and the Central American countries on immigration, and more importantly, on economic support for the Central American countries. This is an example of how trade can ease geopolitical problems. Incidentally, our biggest trading partner is Canada. The biggest chunk of our purchase of goods from Canada is hydroelectric power. Canada has a huge hydroelectric system. They produce tremendous surpluses of this hydroelectric power, and it's just cheaper for the United States to purchase power from Canada than to build similar systems in the United States. If we were not in good relations with Canada, that might be a different situation. But we are. The pandemic, let me go to my third point. The pandemic has shown the fragility of international communication and trade. One of the reasons that the pandemic spread as rapidly as it was simply because we can communicate with more people all over the world than we ever have before. Communications are easier, travel is easier, people are moving in greater numbers. The flow of people in the world, the migration of people is at its greatest extent in history, even greater than during the periods of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe into the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century. We have more foreign-born citizens in the United States, foreign-born residents in the United States than at any time in our history, even during the early 1900s, when we became, in a very real sense, a hyphenated nation. Polish Americans, Hungarian Americans, Russian Americans, people from many countries. So the pandemic has shown that our tighter connections can create some substantive problems. And it raises the question as how we are going to continue to maintain these increased connections, which are on the whole very beneficial, without jeopardizing the health of our country, just the ability of Americans to live, and also the ability of other countries who are less likely to be able to withstand the rigors of pandemics like we're going through today. Ironically, though, the United States has suffered tremendously from the pandemic, and proportionally much more so than even countries in Africa. A year ago, many African experts were expecting terrific problems in countries like Nigeria and Kenya, advanced economies, South Africa, advanced economies in Africa. That has not materialized, mainly because these governments, which did not have much access to remedies or antidotes or to medical supplies to combat COVID-19, did engage in very extensive quarantining and took very drastic immediate measures to try to slow the movement of people so as to reduce the spread of COVID-19, and they've been largely successful. But I want to leave you with this. The world needs trade, but we need secure trade. We trade with China, but we should not be open to just letting the Chinese do anything they want. To use a phrase from Ronald Reagan when he was president and was negotiating with Mikhail Gorbachev, the general secretary of the Presidium of the Soviet Union, about arms negotiations. He liked using a Russian phrase, trust but verify. Trust but verify. We can do the same thing. We can use that same approach that Reagan talked about in the 1980s in dealing with countries like China. We need the Chinese need us. We have different views as to who should be influencing what in Asia, but we also need each other in terms of economic activities. So the question, I think, for the next 20 to 30 years, as the Chinese economy grows, as the United States remains the most productive nation in the world with a much higher per capita gross domestic product than any other nation, is how do we approach countries like China? How do we approach countries that with whom we have important relationships so that we can protect our flow of goods and services, so we can protect our interests, but so that we can also promote less military involvement, less military risk, how we can ease tensions, how we can use trade to ease tensions rather than to exacerbate tensions. Recently, there's been a conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia over a region known as Nagorno-Karabakh. Try to find it on the map. It took me about half an hour with the Rand McNally to find it. That fight was over minerals that can be used in processing in making computer chips. That's the only reason that these two nations want to assert their control. Trade and the need for being involved in trade can cut both ways. And our goal should be over the next 20 to 30 years, which will be a problem for my son and his generation, because I'll be long gone by that time, is how do we make trade beneficial for our interest, but at the same time, how can we use trade to ease world tensions, to promote growth in countries such as, for example, Bangladesh, other countries, and how that trade can benefit the entire world and help reduce the threats that continue to exist in our world. And I'll now turn the program back over to Dr. Crean, and I'll take whatever questions we have.
Thank you, Professor Stine, for that delightfully informative talk. Now, for those of you who are here, you can send the questions through the message system of the chat room on this application, and then I will read them for him. And in the meantime, I have some questions of my own, which shall begin the conversation. So you mentioned that China, in terms of its leverage over us, them running a trade surplus with us, selling us lots of goods, the potential danger of that, American vulnerability. The Chinese, of course, it's not entirely a one-way trade, especially in terms of economically strategic materials. And I'm thinking here of chip technology, that China makes a lot of electronics, as you've noticed, but they're not able to make all the component parts, especially certain high-skilled, high value-added component parts, such as China at the moment is unable to manufacture every part of a microchip on its own. And there are things it needs from us, small but crucial elements it needs from us to make their chips work. And one of the things the Trump administration did a year or two ago is they cut off that supply of technology to China because of things like theft of intellectual property and so forth. China's been trying to figure out how to make it for themselves. They probably will at some point, but to date they have not, and it has been a bit of a hindrance for them. So I'm wondering if you could speak about that aspect, in that case where we do have some, at least in that one instance, leverage over China, and speak about that issue.
That's a very good point, Dr. Green. The United States is still going to be, I'm old enough to remember the threat of Japan Incorporated back in the 1980s when we thought, America can't adapt to the threat of Japanese domination. Well, Japan still has a very big economy, but certainly, they've never threatened the American economy as had been thought. So the United States, we should not underestimate the ability of American technology to benefit to continue to benefit from our superior educational system, our research facilities, and one important area, and I think this certainly is going to change with the Biden-Harris administration, and that is the United States is going to become more welcoming to researchers, to foreign students, to graduate students, especially from other countries, particularly in STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But in a sense, I generally think of myself as a free trader, but I wouldn't go so far as to, I think there are limits. It's like there's no right that is completely unfettered. The same thing with our trade. If we can continue, despite all the debt that we're selling to China, if we can continue to use some methods of leverage to influence Chinese decisions about the Muslims in Western China, about Tibet, about dissidents in China. Again, China is a signatory to the Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. Then we should use that. I think that when we are like, again, to borrow from Ronald Reagan, when we are more like a city on a hill, we are doing not only what is morally and politically right, but also what is economically right. So I think that if there are restrictions, there are appropriate times to put restrictions on trade. And this would be one of those, that the United States should be very careful about opening up trade for these very critical parts.
Very good. Question from Jackie for you, Stephen. Would you care to comment on the issue of counterfeiting, especially in light of instances recently of counterfeit masks and PPE and so forth?
Yes, that's again, when you are dependent upon someone else for anything, and certainly this crisis, this pandemic has shown that, when you're dependent on any source for a particular good, then you have to be careful, of course, in making sure that whatever you're obtaining is safe. And also, it should be, there are certain things that this should encourage, since we expect COVID to be around probably for a number of decades. This should encourage us to be willing to create industries within our country, or to facilitate the manufacture within our country of things like the masks, the protective devices that Jackie's pointed to. This could be an incentive for us to develop a high quality PPE. You can go back to the example in World War II. The reason that synthetics and eventually plastics came about was simply because the U.S. economy was heavily dependent upon rubber from Indonesia, what was then the control of the Dutch West for most, almost to even until the end of the war. And the United States had to engage in a crash development program, encouraged, of course, by the incentive of the existential event of World War II, to develop synthetics. So we should be careful. We should not we should not run up cost unnecessarily and tip the economic balance regressively as far as products like PPEs. But this might be an opportunity to give us a great opportunity to develop a more extensive medical equipment industry in the United States.
Excellent. Question now from Marilyn Wills. Marilyn writes, with the expansion of worldwide trade through the World Wide Web, is there any way to monitor or guarantee quality and or the safety of products?
Yes, there are. This raises it's a good question, Marilyn. We have in the world various organizations, the World Trade Organization, the International Labor Organization, which goes back to the time of the League of Nations in the 1920s. We have a whole series of bilateral, multilateral trade agreements outside of these big trade organizations, which could be used to punish countries that engage in counterfeiting, like the PPE problem that Jackie referred to, and also that could be used to encourage countries to, like Bangladesh, for instance, to continue to expand their economies, but without causing the deaths of thousands of workers, as has occurred in their country, in Bangladesh. These would be these are going to be difficult matters, however, to change, because there are so many economic forces that benefit from poorly paid people working in terrible conditions, that even benefit, as in some countries, from the equivalent of slave labor. So we do have already the existing structures to deal with some of these problems, but it's a matter of generating the political force, the political will, and that is often very difficult to do, but it is possible.
Very good. Related to we were talking about earlier with China and technology, while they are dependent on certain aspects of our technology, They are also exporting their own innovative technology, for instance, in artificial intelligence, and especially recently, and this relates to the national security issue, 5G technology, where we make our version, they make their version. Their version is often cheaper and less expensive for many countries to install, including some of our allies, like the British. And we've been having a bit of a diplomatic tussle in the last couple of years with those allies over trying to convince and cajole them not to install Chinese-made 5G because of security reasons. And I'm wondering if you could go into that issue.
That's a very good point, Dr. Green. The 5G has enormous potential for massively improving productivity, for greatly improving access to computer system, to electronic systems, to the internet, to other transmission systems. What the United States, I think, could offer, and this is where we get back to the issue. This is where the issue of security comes in. Is to the British. Yes, China is a very important economic power, but remember, it so far has shown very few signs of shifting to any kind of democracy. The old thinking was a capitalist system, which China has largely adopted, will lead ultimately to democracy. To me, that if that's ever been the case, it's certainly not the case so far with China. So our question, what we can pose to the British is just a simple trade. The idea that the British approach when they were the world's dominant leader was, we can just buy you off if you're some type of creating some kind of problem for the British Empire in Asia or in India, certainly, and in Africa. We can simply buy you off. Well, the United States should be able to offer something to Great Britain that the Chinese cannot offer. Maybe and this is allowed under certain circumstances under the WTO, and certainly the complaint process takes a very long time, is we simply dump. We simply say, we'll sell you at whatever price, and we'll dump our product on the British market. And then once we are in, then we can raise prices to recoup the losses later on. That might be an approach that we could take. But certainly, I think that we should continue as much negotiation and much cooperation with the Chinese where we can. But we should also realize that these are two very, very different systems in many respects, far different even than the Japanese and American systems, which, of course, by the time of Japan incorporated in the 1980s, Japan was a parliamentary liberal democratic nation. So I would say, to go back to Marilyn's question, we've got to be, there are ways, or back to your question, Dr. Green, there are ways that we can negotiate to improve our position, even with these products that the Chinese might be able to undercut us on.
Yeah, very good. Now, a question from our colleague, Gerald Burnett. With the intense globalization of production, supply chains, and trade, have we reached the point where global corporate interests now outweigh national political interests?
Very good point. Thank you, Professor Burnett. There's an old joke in foreign policy circles from the 1980s and 1990s. One that I think Dr. Henry Kissinger loved to tell, and it was that the nations of the world should no longer engage in setting up diplomatic relations. What they should do is simply name ambassadors to various corporations, Nestle's, U.S. Steel when it was still big operation, AT&T, Siemens, Mitsubishi, the Alibaba now in China. In many respects, and this has been true since we entered into the post-World War II era. In many respects, corporate interest, transnational interest, have replaced, to some extent, their power has replaced the power of national governments. And so long that works both ways. Transnational governments, the multinational, transnational and multinational corporations want stability. They want free flow of goods and services. However, the drawback to that is they may not necessarily have as strong a commitment to fair labor regulations. Again, back to Bangladesh, they may not care at all about the plight of the Muslims in Western China, or the plight of the Tibetans in China. They may be just as happy to deal with the corporations owned by the People's Liberation Army in China as they would with any civilian corporation. So the question then is, how do governments just throw up their hands and say, well, the big corporations are going to run everything? Or do governments like countries in Western Europe, in the Americas, in Oceania, even democracies like India, say that we have to create some kind of enforcement so that we benefit, that the benefits of global trade, of global interaction, access to social media, et cetera, is something that can be useful for the greater good, for increased freedoms for people. I'm pessimistic about this because I don't think we're winning this battle. I think the authoritarianism is very much very strong in the world. Trade may be used by authoritarian powers to increase their authoritarianism simply because they don't feel like they have to deal with governments. They only have to deal with transnational corporations.
Very good. Now, speaking of transnational corporations, I'd like to pivot to the pharmaceutical industry, specifically vaccines and COVID-19 vaccines. And that has, since these companies are often based in certain countries can get, if they want, try to have preferential access to vaccine supplies. This has created something of a tussle between not only developed nations like the US, Britain, the European Union, but also between those developed nations and lesser developed nations which have less ability to manufacture large quantities of vaccine. I'm wondering if you could talk about the supply chain issues involved with that very pertinent issue.
This is where the United States, interestingly, can look to places that we might not have thought of until 2020, until February 2020, as new sources for vaccinations. And I'm thinking of Cuba. The United States has a very fraught relationship with Cuba. Cuba stands out in our international relations much bigger in size than it really deserves. And that's because there's several million Cuban Americans living in Florida, and Florida has 29 electoral votes. So Cuban issues become important in American political issues. But what I see is that Cuba has a remarkably, especially since it's really still a third world country, has a remarkably advanced medical system. It has a very good pharmaceutical system. They're very good. It's probably the maybe the best pharmaceutical system in the Americas, outside of, outside of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. If the United States, if we're going to continue to have to deal with bringing in large numbers of vaccinations on a regular basis to deal with COVID and the COVID offshoots, then we're going to have to look at improving relations with countries like Cuba. We're going to have to look at new sources. We can't do all of it ourselves, and in fact, we might not want to do all of it ourselves. There are other less expensive but acceptable products that we could vaccines rather, that we could use for vaccinations. So I think we have to look at, we have to take a fresh look. Again, crises often create new openings. We have to look at new openings to countries that have good pharmaceutical systems. Cuba, as an example, there are many questions about the vaccine that was developed in China, about its effectiveness. To what extent do we essentially underwrite foreign sources like Cuba or Great Britain? Great Britain's had very good success with its program with AstraZeneca. So that's the kind. We have to look. We have to take a fresh look at our relations with pharmaceutical manufacturers around the world.
Very good. And finally, I'd just like to point out, when we get to the supply chains, things we don't necessarily think of, even in places like Tyler Smith County, which perhaps we should have, given the nature of our religious culture here, that when Trump put across the board 25% tariffs on China about 3 years ago, one of the issues that became known, which was not known to me or probably most Americans, was that about 50% of the Bibles bought in the United States are manufactured in China. They have maintained the printing presses, which can print efficiently on the very thin paper that is used to make Bibles. And so naturally, his religiously conservative supporters lobbied him to make an exemption for Bibles as kind of a strategic material in its own way, which as a deacon yourself, I'm sure you can appreciate that. So
we live in a complicated world.
Yes, we do. Yes. And who would have thought that after a century of pushing Christianity on China, now they make the Bibles for us? And,
it's ironic.
Yes. And we will leave with that. And join us again next week for our 8th and final installment in this series. I would like to thank Professor Stine for his enlightening contribution today, and to all of you who have attended, and to all of you who will surely watch this later on, the recording on YouTube. And till next Thursday at noon, goodbye, everyone.